Hello and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ismail Jalil for düzdanışaq, an Azerbaijani channel translated as Straight Talk. We're broadcasting from Washington, D.C. for the entire region of the South Caucasus, Eurasia, former Soviet Union, and Central and Eastern Europe. And we discuss pertinent matters for that matter. So today, let me give you a brief introduction into our conversation today. I discovered the guest by accident on Twitter. I don't think we've even been connected. His name is Zakir Rzazade. He just finished research, a thesis, and submitted it to Masarykova University in Brno, the Czech Republic. And the topic is fascinating. Not to do injustice to it, let me show it to you on screen. Images of a peacekeeper, post-war perceptions of Russian peacekeepers in Azerbaijan. In itself, I believe this topic is fascinating. This is probably the first, at least the first that I've seen, research on the subject, and I'm hoping there will be many more. The topic itself is fascinating. To me, it's fascinating because I wonder whether its results can be extrapolated to the rest of the regions of former Soviet Union, where Russians have inserted themselves as a peacekeeping force. Be it Transnistria in Moldova, be it Abkhazia in Georgia, be it Karabakh in Azerbaijan, the Russians have a particular image, and whether they act in uniform or whether their peacekeeping forces operation differs from country to country based on foreign policy objectives of the Russian Federation is another topic, and I believe it would be interesting to discuss that, to compare the behavior of the so-called peacekeepers. And please forgive me my bias. We'll talk about my bias with the guest. I'm quite interested in what he has to say about the extent to which my perception of the Russian Federation and its peacekeeping force, I almost said keeping force, Freudian slips are quite informative. Whether it's based on my traumas of the 20th of January 1990, the events that I witnessed myself, being on the street, protesting against the Russian behavior, or the perception of the massacre in Khojaly, to which a large swath, maybe the overwhelming majority of the Azerbaijani people, believe the Russian army is complicit of. In any case, lots of political issues around this topic, but we'll try to keep it purely along the lines of the research my today's guest has conducted. Let's say hello to Zakir Rzazade. Hi, and thank you for coming.
Hi, Ismail. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I'll be honest. I read the research, most of it. I tried not to read the findings, so as to not to be biased or prejudiced by my prior knowledge. I wanted to learn about the findings on the air, but I couldn't hold, and I went into it, and pages 47 and onwards were quite interesting to me. I am very curious. Let's start with general. How did this topic come about? What compelled you to even research this topic?
I started my master's studies in 2020 autumn, and that was at the same time when the war happened between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And yeah, I knew that I am going to write my thesis, final thesis about the conflict and especially Azerbaijan-Armenia relations. But the culmination of the war with the ceasefire agreement brought me new questions about the issue, because it was a victory for Azerbaijanis. But on the other hand, the clause about the Russian peacekeepers and their deployment in Karabakh created different ideas or different, atmosphere in the minds of Azerbaijanis. We saw it in social media, we saw it in one-to-one conversations, and there were many explanations, many reasonings why it shouldn't have happened, shouldn't have been let. So forth and so on. And these issues brought me the question how Azerbaijanis think about Russian peacekeepers in general. What are the psychological sources of these perceptions, these attitudes? Over time, I was already engaging with the literature in international relations. And even though this literature was mostly about the elite level or expert level perceptions of other states, other actors, I decided to apply it to the ordinary population, so to say if it's applicable and it can give us any beneficial results that it can be used in practical real life.
I was going to ask you next, how do you think this research is relevant? In other words, if we take a case study, we study a subject, which the things that you write in your thesis, in order to be able to generalize the experience and knowledge to similar subjects or similar areas or similar objects even. So let's talk about how and why do you think this research is relevant? Can it be, what can we learn from it?
Yeah, sure. So one of the issues that I've encountered during my literature review especially was that the many international organizations, especially United Nations, was recommending that taking into account the local perceptions in the peacekeeping operations or peacekeeping missions is important part in terms of effectiveness of those missions, especially the legitimacy and trust towards those actors, those peacekeeping forces are important in maintaining a healthy relationship and in the steps towards peace, in final peace building processes. And in terms of this issue, these recommendations by many organizations, I saw that like if we are going to analyze, if we are going to explain and apply it to other cases, we can do from different perspective. We need to bring the psychology into this legitimacy issue. In terms of legitimacy and trust towards peacekeeping missions, there were research works, quite a lot of them. But I've never seen the one that using specific psychological approaches that mainly analyzes the pre-existence beliefs and impact of pre-existence beliefs, impact of the perception of the identity of those peacekeeping forces. For example, I can mention one research by Alan Durma, and he, for example, was explaining in African context that local people trusted African peacekeeping forces more than non-African ones, and bringing African forces brought more effectiveness in the mission. And in terms of these dynamics, I saw that in terms of, let's say, peacekeeping legitimacy, the trust towards peacekeeping forces, which is quite important for the final effectiveness. We can look at those issues from psychological perspective and try to see in these lenses how it can be applied to one case, and if it can be generalized. It's quite interesting that you also mentioned that it can be generalizable, applicable to other cases, let's say Moldova or Georgia or any other countries that Russian peacekeepers resides right now. And one of the results that will probably come to that point is that identity of the peacekeeping forces, the country in the contingency, is important factor in the first place. Of course, later on, the outcomes or the procedures of the peacekeeping forces can change somehow perceptions. But the first thing that people think about the out-group nation coming to your country is how they thought about it before. What's the main perceptions? What's the pre-existence beliefs that exist in the society, in the national consciousness?
All right, you're underlying a few notions that I would like you to explain to the audience in a way that not all of us understand political science, and not all of us are, educated in this field. So first of all, I would like you to explain what image theory is in very simple terms, and also the neo-positivist philosophy, because these two notions sort of underpin your the way you conducted your research and the way you published your findings. Can we talk about that for a second?
Sure. Starting with image theory. Image theory is an alternative way of looking at foreign policy behavior of states, or foreign policy decision making. And there are many approaches, starting with, for example, the realist, that's most common or most popular in even in the broader audiences. That takes mostly, like, it's more complex than it is, but if we can put it more simply, it's looking at mostly the power relations, material part of the interstate relations, and how it can impact decisions and how it can impact the international system in general. But the image theory, on the other hand, looks at the issue through 3 dimensions. First is about how the in-group country, in-group actor perceives the out-group in terms of their threat level or goal incompatibility. The out-group country is threatening, or it provides, or it has some prospects for cooperation in future. In terms of goal incompatibility, if those 2 countries has compatible goals or incompatible goals, if there is a space for cooperation or conflict more. Second lens is about how the in-group country looks at the second out-group country in terms of their capabilities, most importantly military capabilities. If the second out-group country is perceived as inferior or superior. And the third point is about the cultural status. If the in-group country sees the second out-group country culturally superior or inferior, how sophisticated is the second out-group country is. And through the different combinations of these 3 lenses, different kinds of images emerge. If you want, I can more get into and explain what kind of images exist.
So not to lose our audience, it's basically behavior depends on the image kind of approach, right? I mean, if I were to condense everything that we're talking about into one sentence, the behavior of a nation depends on the image it has and the image it projects. Would that be too simplistic?
Yeah, no, it's correct, and it somehow that summarizes nicely the general concept. Thank you.
Yeah, we try to keep it very popular so we don't get lost in this, and our audience, we don't mislead our audience as well. And if you could, a couple of words about the neo-positivist philosophy.
Sure. That issue is mentioned in the context of methodological approach. It means that we can study things realistically, but also neo-positivist way, in a way like qualitative approach, that there are things that can be observed, can be explained by looking at them objectively. There are different approaches like constructivism that says that we have bias in ourselves, that we cannot observe and explain and research other things objectively. But in my research, I took the philosophical approach of neo-positivism, qualitative neo-positivism, that takes that we can observe things outside and objectively analyze them and put into a context.
Okay. I wanted to quote I wanted to quote your research, if you give me 2 seconds, because I'm trying to do way too many things with one hand. And show it on screen as I read, if you allow me. Common grievance was that the Russian military in Azerbaijan meant limitations on Azerbaijani sovereignty and reduced the range of options in foreign policy. For years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the restoration of independence, the absence of Russian troops on Azerbaijani soil symbolically signified a certain level of sovereignty in effect, enabled the government to conduct a relatively independent foreign and domestic policy. This is page 10 of your research. I'm kind of curious as to if you could expand on that. That common grievance against the Russian military, that it will come and it will limit the Azerbaijani sovereignty in one way or the other, and may or may not dictate what sort of foreign policy decisions the government of Azerbaijan will be making. Do you think that grievance is pinned in reality? Do you think that people take it seriously? What was your finding? How important were these points to the respondents that you talked to?
As it's mentioned there, and also in the interview analysis findings parts, there was a point about it and there was a truth to it. I'm talking about both in terms of perceptions, that's subjective, and also in terms of objective view of myself. And we can tell that, like, in terms of, for example, let's take one example, Azerbaijani relationship with Western countries, with European Union. We could say that if there was no threat of Russian peacekeepers in Azerbaijani soil, we could have seen maybe more relaxed, more independent approach towards that issue. But the fact that Russian peacekeepers are located and residing in Azerbaijani soil, just as it's the case in Moldova, let's say, that it's kind of constraining that country's foreign policy options, that there is a truth to that perception, also to that view that Russian peacekeepers is somehow limiting Azerbaijani options, mostly in terms of foreign policy, but also somehow domestic policy too.
Mhm. You know, I would like to quote another part, and I'll show it on the screen as we go. I don't want to waste my time now. Finally, what sort of policy preferences exist in case of some hypothetical confrontation with Russia in the context of its peacekeeping force? You're asking on page 11, and I'll find it and I'll show it. My question is, do Azerbaijanis that you talk to overwhelmingly perceive Russian peacekeepers as a direct threat to their country? And is military confrontation with Russia as a possibility? Is it quite often discussed or considered among people?
I would say that the issues that came up during my interviews show that there is a general negative attitude towards Russian peacekeepers, and in general, Russia itself is not perceived as a friendly country, but more like a equivalent or like a friend of Armenia. That's also one of the findings that impacted those images, that Russian and Armenian relations are quite important subject that influences Azerbaijan perceptions of Russia itself too, and also peacekeepers. On the other hand, the issue about the Russian peacekeepers and the military confrontation, I, to be honest, didn't see an preference for violence or use of force in case there will be some sort of confrontation that's serious in a serious level. And there is a quite aversion to the use of military force because of apparent power asymmetry between Azerbaijan and Russian forces.
Let me ask you this. What was the most interesting and sort of unexpected finding for you? Because I understand that you base your you base your thesis on a premise of what you expected, and you put expectations like E1, E2. I found E9 very interesting. Did your expectations change? Were they proven? In other words, I'm trying to say, are Azerbaijani people thinking uniformly about the presence of the Russian troops? Would that be the same as the way you look at it, or the way I look at it and the rest of the people look at it? So researchers and average people, do we have the same sort of expectations or maybe suspicions or fears? Do they vary from group to group? Also, you could comment, I noticed that it was almost similar, 55% men and 45% women. Do men and women look at the peacekeeping force, Russian peacekeeping force, similarly? Can you juxtapose other groups of people, generations, socioeconomic level, let's say?
To be honest, to compare those groups in terms of the age, generation, gender, or how to say, like ethnic, let's say, groups, my research is based on qualitative approach. That's why I didn't seek representativeness of whole Azerbaijanis. I seeked teams, main teams, topics that came up during interviews. That's why the research doesn't necessarily talk about the comparison of those groups and how they differently look at it. But in terms of saturation, the teams covered, I have observed very quite common themes that shapes Azerbaijani perceptions and informs those perceptions. And I would say that if I may, I can tell that there was no, at least based on my research, I didn't see any difference between those groups. But there was one interesting point that I interviewed one ethnic Russian woman, and her approach was totally different from those of Azerbaijanis. And
can we discuss how? Is it okay?
Sure, no problem. It was anonymous, so we can discuss it. The issue is that she was quite hesitant to talk about those issues, and when there were different questions about how she thinks about Russian peacekeepers, how she thinks Russia as Azerbaijani's friend or enemy, or somehow how she can locate that country in the Azerbaijani foreign policy. but her answers was quite hesitant, and also I saw the impact of Russian propaganda in those answers. For example, even though I didn't ask questions about the NATO, I didn't ask about questions that like Western integration. She was few times mentioning those issues as a mistake from Western side that, for example, somehow provocates Russia. Let's say that's wrong approach for Azerbaijanis to think about it in this way.
So, in other words, I'm trying to understand the logic. Somehow, the presence of the Russian troops in Azerbaijan to sort of preserve peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia was put in a context of NATO and the West, the perceived threat from the West to Russia, or to herself, or to Azerbaijan.
To Russia. To Russia, even though it wasn't a relevant answer in this context, I saw that she was making comparisons based on those teams. That was quite common. We can see it on main Russian TV channels, Russian social media, Russian Telegram channels, that it was quite mentioned, talking points for any issue about Russian foreign policy and Russian security.
Okay. This question I wasn't going to ask, but since we're already discussing this, let me show you one of the quotes from one of the respondents. Again, this is a quote from a person who responded to your questions. And direct quote is, Russians are chauvinists. For example, Russians living in Azerbaijan were not willing to learn Azerbaijani language. They oppressed us Azerbaijanis while living in Azerbaijan. Do you think people made this is it on the people's, in the back of the people's minds when they view the peacekeeping force coming from Russia? Do they equate it with Russians living in Azerbaijan? And if I may, from what I understood this comment to mean, this person, an unidentified respondent, is talking about the past. They're not talking about today's Russians living in the ethnic Russians, Azerbaijani citizens living in Azerbaijan. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. It was a question about the cultural differences between Azerbaijanis and Russians, and also how she perceives the presence of Russian peacekeeping in Azerbaijan. And that was actually one of the main goals of this research, that to show how history, how the first-hand experiences, for example, that person lived during the Soviet period as well, and how these first-hand experiences explains or informs their beliefs and approaches to Russian peacekeepers. And that was a quote about with regards to Soviet period. But still, the ethnic Russians living in Azerbaijan is still equated with, in general, Russians and their culture.
Mm-hmm. All right. I was trying to ask this question, and then I got completely derailed and confused you. So what was the most unexpected for you to learn during these interviews?
Well, in terms of the theories that I applied, that expectations that you also mentioned, the one finding that came up that influenced images was about how the third party can influence the perception of Azerbaijanis and Russian peacekeepers. Even though we Azerbaijanis can understand this issue quite well and see the relation connections, but in the theory, it wasn't expected. That was about mainly how the Armenian-Russian relations, their historical interaction, affected how Azerbaijanis perceive these relations. For example, the main talking points were about during Russian Empire, the central government's attempts to bring Armenians and settle it in Azerbaijani territories, or like Karabakh, or Russia as a source of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that used this as a tool to exploit and control the territory, control the region, or Russia's use of Armenia as a tool against Azerbaijan. So, for example, Christian bulwark, that was one of the mentioned points as well, that people was putting it somehow in the context of religious confrontation too, that Russia's main reason why Russia is allied or is friends with Armenia is because they are sharing the same identity.
Hmm. All right. I would want to know, asking all these questions to Azerbaijanis, of course, it helps us understand how our society functions and thinks. What do you think? And I'm asking a political question. You may not respond if you don't wish. It's okay because I invited you to discuss this particular thesis, but I have to ask this question. What do you think our politicians should learn from it? Do you think, in other words, if we were to send this research to the Azerbaijani Foreign Affairs Ministry, to the presidential apparatus, to all the decision-making bodies in the Azerbaijani government, do you think any of this would be surprising to them? Do you think they know this? Do you think they're taking all of this into account?
I would say for Azerbaijanis, it can be somehow understood and known that that kind of perceptions exist toward Russian peacekeepers. But the main points, main key points, main talking points, or like milestones that affect those attitudes are not exactly structured and presented, I would say, in the public. I'm not sure about the foreign policy administration, but I would say in the public and in academic sense, it wasn't structured and presented. And one of the implications of my study, practical real life implications of study, was about how it can be used, how these results can be used not only in Azerbaijan but also in other contexts, that if those methodology, if those approach were applied. And that was about that there are two sides to these results. There are implications that can be taken from two perspectives. One, if there is that kind of perceptions and there is kind of a critical situation and dangerous situation that can somehow obstruct the peace process. And in this way, for example, authorities, peace building programs can address those issues, those grievances, those main talking points, perceptions, so they can inject some trust into the issue. The local population can be more trusting towards peacekeepers, not necessarily Russian peacekeepers. And in this way, it can serve in a positive way that it can contribute to peace building process. On the other hand, there is a second part of the issue. Those points, those grievances may be somehow known and also open to public or foreign policy administration. In a structured manner, they can be used to aggravate those grievances as well. So it's like two-sided sword that can cut every part. So like it depends how you want to approach it.
Listening to the grievances that you're expressing here, your respondents have that you're basically reciting that your respondents have expressed. I'm kind of curious. If these were not Russian peacekeepers, but peacekeepers from another country that is perceived as more neutral, doesn't matter which one, Finland, Iceland, Norway, doesn't matter. A nation that is not perceived by the people of Azerbaijan as being on the Armenian side. Do you think the majority of the people's fear or unease would sort of fall off and disappear? Or is it, in other words, is it specific to the peacekeepers being from Russia, or is it unease with foreign troops on the Azerbaijani soil in general?
It's interesting because that question came up during my thesis defense too. About
and
that.
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm acting like your thesis defense committee, peppering you with questions, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's mainly about the Russian identity there. During my interviews, I have observed many preferences. And first thing, of course, I would say everyone knows that it was about the inclusion of Turkish peacekeepers in the contingency that can somehow balance out the perceived Russian and Armenian closeness. On the other hand, I have seen also comments about preference towards Nordic countries that's perceived more of impartial and neutral, not neutral actors towards the region. And to answer your question, yes, it was more about the Russian identity and its imperial and expansionist past that Azerbaijanis are wary of. And I would say it would depend which countries. I would say it depends which countries to come to replace Russian peacekeepers. Their identity will be still important. For example, let's replace Russian peacekeepers with French peacekeepers. Even though there will be different perceptions, different beliefs, different reasonings behind it, it will be still negative. And for example, French-Armenian relations will be an important factor, or the presence of big Armenian diaspora in France will be an important factor in shaping Azerbaijani perceptions towards the issue. But as you mentioned, for example, Nordic countries were perceived more of a neutral actors that can contribute to this protest. Azerbaijani people wouldn't have any problem having them in Azerbaijani soil.
I mentioned Nordic countries because that's where the Western mind usually goes. I mean, who has a problem with Norway? Who has a problem with Finland? I mean, who has a problem with Iceland? But on the other hand, it made me think, and I wrote like a whole bunch of questions for you, and I'm asking completely new ones, which keep coming up as we speak, which is very fascinating to me. Look, you already mentioned the susceptibility of some of your respondents to Russian propaganda, which is very interesting to me, and a topic that I would love to talk about, probe as much as I could. But I'm kind of curious what other sorts of sources of information or propaganda, as it may be, are coming into play here. Because when it comes to Nordic countries, we all know that a lot of Azerbaijanis are watching Turkish television, and Turkey currently is embroiled in a conflict with Sweden and Finland over their accession to NATO. What do you think influences the people in Azerbaijan more? Was it Turkish television? Was it Russian television? What other sources of narratives that pop up in your interviews? Did you even think of that when talking to them?
Yeah, of course. The issue is that when trying to research perceptions, there are two sides. That situational factors that happening right now that can impact the views and the more pre-existing beliefs. And I also saw some issues related to this first part, situational, and the context in which at which time these interviews were happening. I would say that when it comes to Russian peacekeepers and their presence there, most of the responses, most of the grievances that we mentioned already were coming from the past history. The current propaganda, I would say, wasn't that influential in this issue, if it even exists. For example, the issues that came up most was about the Black January or Khojaly massacre, or the Soviet propaganda that brainwashed Azerbaijani people and other countries in the region, or I would say the Bolshevik invasion of Azerbaijan and the end of Fourth Azerbaijan Republic. Those were the main issues that Azerbaijanis referred to inform about their negative attitudes toward Russian peacekeepers and their undesirability. When it comes to the situational factors, for example, I mentioned the interview with one respondent and the Russian propaganda talking points. It was mostly, when it comes to Azerbaijanis, I didn't see in the context that there is somehow the impact of governmental propaganda, because at the time the Azerbaijanis, the impact of the governmental propaganda can affect, but to an extent that it can already show the already existing grievances. For example, during my interviews, it was October, and there was an issue already somehow that we would call like anti-Russian somehow news, for example, in main Azerbaijani channels during the month. But those issues were already existing in Azerbaijani minds. For example, Azerbaijani TVs wasn't showing about the Khojaly massacre or Black January or any other historical issues. But the existence of this kind of tendency in Azerbaijani official media can also made it more easy for Azerbaijanis to speak about those issues, not to hesitate and go against, let's say, governmental official agenda.
Mm-hmm. If I may, Kurban Said brings a very interesting point, and I wanted to address that with you. Let me read the question. Maybe I was late for the stream and this was already discussed, but were Armenians from Karabakh part of a qualitative research? If yes, what were their thoughts, concerns, and dreams? In other words, I believe you've talked to 22 people, and only several were from Ganja, and the rest were from Baku, right? I'm kind of curious. Did it occur to you that you could interview the ethnic Armenian population of Karabakh? Was it even relevant to the research, or were you trying to find out what Azerbaijanis think of the Russian peacekeeping force in Azerbaijan?
In the beginning of my research, I thought about it, but because of the basic, simple logistics and also unpracticality of the issue, I decided to focus more on Azerbaijani part that can be accessed and observed more objectively. That's why it wasn't much of a possible choice to interview Armenians from Karabakh, even though it could have added very valuable results to the research.
Did any of the Azerbaijanis, or did it even come up during your question and answer sessions? Did anyone express fear or concern that Russians may simply not leave the country when their time comes up and when their peacekeeping mission expires, like they did in Transnistria? I believe it expired a long time ago, and they're still there in Moldova. Were any of these fears vocalized by any of your respondents?
Yes, I would say there were, regarding to this issue, there were two parts of answers, two sides of points of view, I would say. First, as you said, there were people saying that it's, let's say, let me quote or paraphrase those answers, it's in Russian mentality, it's in Russian character that they won't go, they won't be forced out, so they can leave Azerbaijan even after the expiration date. And it was again informed by other experiences that Russia conducted, for example, Moldova or Georgia, the war in Georgia, that if Azerbaijanis somehow try to resist to that temptation, there would be a military confrontation. And there was that fear, there was that concern that Russian peacekeepers won't be leaving. And the second part was in contrast to that point of view, saying that Russian peacekeepers to force Russian peacekeepers out of Azerbaijan would be relatively easy because of two factors. First, Azerbaijan army is more powerful, because proven by the last war in 2020, and also the Russia is embroiled in a conflict against Ukraine that they don't have enough resources to resist Azerbaijan. So I would say there were two parts to this question, that one positive and the second negative, saying that no, Russians won't leave as usual.
There is this part that I wanted you to clarify, and I'm really, really sorry if I do sound like your committee again in asking all these questions. But it was fascinating to me, and I wanted to make sure that I understand it right. Expectations proposed on attribution theory were also confirmed. Most of the respondents exhibited negative view towards the Russian peacekeeping mission. Meanwhile, explanations for the missions and Russia's behavior, and also comparisons between Azerbaijan and Russia, demonstrated the existence of fundamental attribution error, assigning positive behavior of the Russian side to situational factors and attributing the negative behavior to dispositional ones. Positively perceived behavior on the part of Russian peacekeepers were also attributed to the success, righteousness, and power of Azerbaijan. The effect of Soviet years and the 1990s were especially salient in the minds of the people. Analogies from these periods played an important role in formulation of judgments and perceptions. In other words, if I understand it correctly, when Russia behaved the way that the people of Azerbaijan expected, they attributed it to the military strength of Azerbaijan or to the righteousness of Azerbaijan. And when Russia behaved in the ways that were perceived as negative, what was that? Where would that attribution go? What would people think was the reason for that?
Yeah, in the first case, I would say that when Russian peacekeepers behaved in the way that Azerbaijani people or Azerbaijani interests would appreciate, it was mainly correlated with the fact that Azerbaijan is more stronger Azerbaijani military is more stronger. That's why Russian peacekeepers cannot do anything about it. Or Azerbaijan is in the right side. These lands belong to Azerbaijan, so Russia knows that. That's why Russia cannot do anything. Or Azerbaijan diplomacy were quite successful. The relations between Azerbaijan and Turkey, Azerbaijan and Israel, that Azerbaijan built somehow a base that they can deter any Russian threat. And in terms of second part, that the behavior from Russian peacekeepers that's perceived somehow negatively and undesirable for Azerbaijanis and Azerbaijani interests, it was attributed to Russian identity and, for example, Russian imperial character, Russian expansionist character, Russian chauvinism, or Russian Armenian friendship, or their Christian identity that brings them together against Azerbaijanis or Turks in this region.
Exactly after this quote you're talking about, let me quote it. Moving on to the expectations from the image theory, the observed dominant image was primarily that of a barbarian. So in other words, that was the perception of the Russian force, barbarian. Am I correct? Because you keep talking about it throughout your thesis. What is that image of a barbarian? What sort of threat does it contain in itself? And do you think that, again, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to the government's behavior. Do you think all that, everything, all the negativity of the Russian image, barbarian, doesn't get worse than that, came into play when the decision was made to bring the Russian peacekeepers? Was the government aware? Is there something new about this that people may not know? How overwhelming is this perception of Russians as barbarians? And the war in Ukraine, let's forget Ukraine. I'm going to come to it in a separate point. Go ahead.
Sure. So to explain what barbarian image means, it's a image that sees Russia and Russian peacekeepers as militarily powerful, threatening, and also culturally inferior to that of Azerbaijani. So Azerbaijani culture is more superior to Russian culture. So that view was quite common in the history. If we look at, for example, during Rome Empire, before Christ, or the following period, their view towards the Germanic tribes, barbarian image, or Chinese perceptions towards how to say the Mongols or other nomadic tribes in the region. And that image implies recklessness, implies aversion, not aversion. I'm sorry, it was a. But the tendency to use force, military force, even it's not needed, and the all-time continuing threat towards yourself, and that image basically sums up in the form of barbarian. So Azerbaijani people ascribing barbarian image to Russian peacekeepers had in mind the country, an actor that is always threatening and reckless and can do things that's not even imaginable, or that we cannot consider it as a rational decision, and we should be wary of this actor all the time because we cannot know what would happen next. And in terms of Azerbaijani government's decision in relation to the ceasefire agreement and the presence or deployment of Russian peacekeepers to Azerbaijan, if you remember that day, there are two events happened that at the last day of this of 44 days of war. One is the helicopter issue. If you remember, the Russian helicopter was shot down near Nakhchivan. Later, it was
allegedly shut down. Yes.
And second issue, Baku was hit, but I guess it was neutralized by the air defense system. And those, even though like not those events were not much in the public and not discussed by official news sites and platforms, but we can see somehow the impact of these events in Azerbaijani perceptions and also in the continuing events after that it led to the signing of this ceasefire treaty. And I would say that the Russian behavior in other post-Soviet countries, in Georgia, in Moldova, invasion of Ukraine, that was like all Russian experts were considering it as a irrational move, even though it happened after a few days. Those acts somehow, I would say, impacts elites as well, not only ordinary population. And elites also consider those events as warnings, as red flags in their behavior towards Russia, and they need to be wary of that, because those are somehow symbolically like signals that shows that what we are capable of. We are not thinking about rational parts of the issue if we need something. So I would say that somehow played a part in the decision to agree to these terms.
As a follow-up, if I may ask, do you think the government of Azerbaijan in any way, you're not a government person and I did not invite you as such, I understand, but do you think people in the government are concerned with the image of Russian, as you put it, barbarian image, the most salient category? Do you think that the people are concerned with that image? Do you think that the Azerbaijani government is neutral to the issue? Do you think they're trying to prove or disprove this image, or strengthen it or weaken it, or do they remain neutral, do you think?
I think for the most part they try to remain neutral and not to aggravate those images in the public. But as we've seen in many instances, especially in the last few months, there were some sort of confrontations between Azerbaijan and Russia. For example, in Russian televisions, we saw referring to the separatist government as a republic and calling it Artsakh, let's say, in many channels. And after those events, Azerbaijani government tried to step up the game somehow and to show that, yeah, we have that kind of cooperation that's mutual to both of us, but there is also that side of issue that we are aware of, that we are not our goals and our, how to say, visions are not always the same. And in those instances, we can see the references to even I don't know, I guess it was or public TV of Azerbaijan or Astave, the main channel, official channel, that started to voice negative and the negative picture of Russia, even to the broader audiences, even though it wasn't norm before.
Well, thank you for bringing it up, the role of television and all this, because I understand that no research is conducted in vacuum. And speaking of vacuum, I believe you mentioned it was done in October of 2022, correct? The war in Ukraine has already started.
Correct.
I am curious as to what was your perception. How did the war in Ukraine and the way it proceeded influence the people's view of Russia? Let me, so not to misquote you, let me look at your thesis here. That is because for those respondents, and you named them here, the numbers they were assigned, who embrace the rogue image, the change in perception of relative capability was caused by Russia's failure in the Russo-Ukrainian War and also Azerbaijan's military success in the war against Armenia in 2020. These respondents exhibited a perception of Russia as a paper tiger or as a declining hegemon. So, in other words, Ukraine showing Russia to be a paper tiger, or colossus with clay feet, as they say, some people say, the power in decline. Does that, do you think, embolden the people in the way they express their feelings about Russia or what they even think? And by definition, since we're talking about the war in Ukraine, did people ever express their views of, are they gloating, are they showing schadenfreude that Russia is not doing well in Ukraine? Are they happy for Ukraine? What were your feelings? What did you notice?
Yeah, starting with the last question, I would say all of the respondents that I interviewed talked about the war in Ukraine in negative terms and as Russia being the cheating part or the aggressive part, and seeing Ukraine, even in some interviews I saw Ukraine was considered and perceived as a friend of Azerbaijan. And that's answer for the last question, that yeah, Azerbaijani people mainly look at the issue from the perspective that Russia is the one to blame and it's the aggressor, and Ukraine and Azerbaijan shares the similar fate somehow as a post-Soviet country. and we need to be careful about it, especially when we have Russian peacekeepers in our soil. Yeah.
Right. If I may come back to Armenia, and we always seem to come back to Armenia, no matter what we discuss. We've already talked a little bit about the perception of Russians as those who resettled Armenia after Turkmenchay Treaty to begin, Armenians, ethnic Armenians in what is now Azerbaijan after, the Turkmenchay Treaty. Lots of things, but I am curious as to, let's say, is every discussion of every topic in Azerbaijan, is it necessarily bringing us to the confrontation with Armenia? Do you think that what a country ABC, like an outside actor, how it behaves vis-a-vis Armenia is a single most important determinant in what Azerbaijani people perceive that power as? Which, I'm asking about Russia, but I'm also thinking about India. Because Azerbaijanis have historically been either neutral towards India or maybe slightly positive towards India in terms of, consuming Indian pop culture, soft power. We grew up watching Bollywood movies. I mean, they were extremely popular in Azerbaijan, and I believe they still remain so. In other words, is this prism through which we Azerbaijanis look at the world, is it always dominated by Armenia?
I would say for the most part, that kind of tendency exists, especially about Russia and the historical background of this issue. And because of this historical background, as you mentioned, Turkmenchay Treaty and the following events that portrays Russia as a friend of Armenia and as an enabler of Armenia against Azerbaijan, those are mainly salient themes that contributes to this image. For example, but like when it comes to other images, other countries and their images, when we talk about India, I would say, even though I haven't encountered or I haven't observed about those issues, my view would be that it wouldn't be as salient as those of Russia because of the lack of historical background in this issue. Mainly people would attribute that issue again another third country, that's Pakistan, that's support of Azerbaijan, and how Pakistani and Indian relations works. And I would say it's mostly about historical background, how the history is full of instances, or it's not full of instances that people can take and refer to explain and inform their beliefs.
When people talk to you, did you feel the background of the question is, I've done journalism in Azerbaijan, and I understand how people are not either used to being asked questions, especially pointed questions like this, and how they become suspicious when you're asking them. Did people easily understand what you're doing, why you're doing it? Were they easy to establish contact with?
Not really. I have done 22 full interviews for the research, but in total I have started 26 or 27 interviews, out of which 22 only became useful because I had to cut some interviews in the middle because people were already trying to get out of the interview or trying to give answers that's not really explaining their views. That's just to avoid some topics. And on the other hand, there were many attempts that I approached people that was easy to get contact and sit somewhere and do the interview, because people were mostly saying that we don't want to involve in political issues and we don't like Russian peacekeepers here, but that's it. I don't have time for that.
Let me ask the final question. What is to come out of this thesis? I messaged you and I said it should definitely be published somewhere. People should see it. When will those who are interested in seeing it be able to see it, and how? And do you plan to do something more with it? Do you plan to continue?
Yes, regarding thesis itself, soon it will be accessible to public from the university database, and I will post it on my social media accounts, and I would also send it to you if you would like to share. And on the other hand, when it comes to the further steps, I am planning to make it in the form of paper to publish in journal, so it can be more accessible. And on the other hand, I'm also planning to continue my PhD studies, and in this topic, I'm interested to get more in this issue more deeper and to analyze different aspects of the Russian peacekeeping and in general peacekeeping and their perceptions.
Zakir, thank you very much for talking to us today, and thank you very much for discussing such an important topic and writing about it. I truly hope I see more studies done by you and more studies done on this topic by others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ismail. Thank you for inviting and giving me opportunity to discuss those issues with you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too.
Ladies and gentlemen, so here is a research I will show you done by today's guest, Zakir Rzazade. Let me show it to you on screen. I truly believe it'll be available very soon, and those of you who are interested could read images of a peacekeeper, post-war perceptions of Russian peacekeepers in Azerbaijan. I don't want to editorialize or comment further on what the guest said today. You can go back and listen to the discussion and come to your own conclusions about this. All I want to say is it is important for a country like Azerbaijan that is not perceived as a very open country around the world, and I understand the reasons why. After all, I am myself in Washington broadcasting from here, because probably I cannot do the same level. I cannot apply the same level of effort being physically in Azerbaijan. But it is important for the people of Azerbaijan to be used to being asked questions, to answer questions, to think about politics, to talk about politics, because we often see that the lack of openness, the lack of ability to discuss issues, the fear or unease or comprehension that come with being asked a question and being asked to respond play out negatively and harm the image of Azerbaijan around the world and create, and we talked about image theory today, right? I mean, the perception, the behavior depends on the perception, and the perception depends on the behavior. These are two mutually, connected issues. You cannot divorce them from one another. I truly hope that what I'm trying to say is understood, and I truly hope that one day Azerbaijan becomes an issue where a country where issues are discussed openly, not only unimpeded by the government, but also assisted by the government. Because once you do not discuss issues, when you sweep everything under the carpet, in the end, these issues boil up. They don't go anywhere. You can lift the carpet and look at all the problems that we Azerbaijanis were discouraged from talking about for the last 30 years. They're all there. They have not diminished, actually. They don't diminish. They blow up. And they become bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they blow up. And this is a very common understanding that we people living in the West have. The way the government works, or the way the government and the society work, of the way the social contract is accepted. But I believe this is an issue where the authorities of Azerbaijan should concentrate on if they are to improve. Remaining the way Azerbaijan is right now is not going to be helpful in resolving the issue of Karabakh. The way Azerbaijan conducts its business, the way the government listens to its own people inside the country, is not the way that most people are willing to accept for the Armenian minority in Azerbaijan. And I guess this goes without saying. I don't think you have to have much, brain power or understanding of the situation to accept. So business as usual is probably not going to work, and business as usual is probably not going to win Azerbaijan any new friends. Maybe it is time to change business as usual slightly, or to what extent it's up to the government, I'm not going to tell them. As a voter, of course, as an Azerbaijani citizen, of course, I have my own list of, I don't want to say demands, but desires of the government. But wants, not demands. But to what extent they're being heard, I have no idea. And without further, discussion, I'll leave you alone with your thoughts. Thank you very much. From Washington, D.C., I'm Ismail Jalilov, and I truly hope we'll talk again this week. Bye-bye.